Atlanta, Georgia. Wednesday, March the 20th, 2021. 10:42. AM 1 small finger. 1 trembling voice. 1 courtroom completely still. In today's emotional and unforgettable courtroom showdown, a 10-year-old black boy stunned everyone with a single sentence. His words pierced the silence, and his courage shook the very walls of justice. This is the story of Elijah Moore. Elijah, nervous and visibly shaken, stepped up to the witness stand. His hands trembled. His feet barely touched the floor. Yet, what he was about to say would leave an entire courtroom breathless. In front of a full gallery, stern lawyers, and a powerful judge, Elijah pointed directly at a police officer, one of the men sworn to serve and protect, and said something that changed everything. This is not just a story about crime or corruption. It is a story about truth, about how even the smallest voice can carry the greatest weight. Elijah Moore, just 10 years old, stood in front of adults who had failed him and told the truth. And in doing so, he shattered the silence that so often protects power. This moment matters. It matters because it shows the bravery of a child who chose truth over fear. It matters because it exposes the painful reality of a system that sometimes allows abuse and misconduct to go unchecked. It matters because Elijah, young as he was, didn't just speak for himself. He spoke for every child who has ever felt powerless in the face of injustice. Inside that courtroom, fear ruled. People rarely challenged authority, but Elijah, with nothing more than his voice and his courage, did what no one else dared to do. He identified the officer responsible. He exposed a lie, and he forced everyone to see the truth that had been hiding in plain sight. The judge paused. The lawyers froze. Even the officer who had been so confident in his uniform couldn't hide the shock. Elijah's finger, small but sure, pointed straight at him, and in that moment, justice shifted. It was no longer about the system. It was about what was right, and Elijah made sure the world would hear it. This is the beginning of a powerful story. A story of heartbreak and hope, of a child who stood up not just for himself, but for every silent victim the system ignored. And in the next 25+ minutes, we will walk through every step of that story, from the incident to the fallout to the final reckoning. Because this isn't fiction, this is real, and Elijah Moore is proof that courage knows no age. Comment: Truth knows no age, if you're ready to see how this brave little boy changed everything. Because sometimes it takes the smallest voice to tell the biggest truth. Elijah Moore was just 10 years old, living in a modest neighborhood in Atlanta with his grandmother after the passing of his mother. Her death, caused by a sudden health crisis, left a void in Elijah's world. But his grandmother became his anchor. A quiet, introspective boy, Elijah loved drawing superheroes in his sketchbook and collecting tiny model trains that he displayed proudly on his windowsill. Life had not been easy, but Elijah carried himself with the quiet strength of someone who had learned to listen, observe, and feel deeply. One evening, as the summer sun dipped behind the rooftops, Elijah and his older cousin Jerome were walking home from a friend's house. They were laughing about a silly joke when they heard shouting up ahead. As they turned the corner, they witnessed a scene that would forever be etched in Elijah's memory. A man, unarmed and clearly frightened, was being thrown to the ground by 2 police officers. The man was already cuffed, but that didn't stop the assault. One officer kicked him in the ribs while the other slammed his knee into the man's back. Blood pooled on the pavement. The sound of fists against flesh cut through the silence of the night. Jerome instinctively pulled Elijah back, whispering urgently, "Come on, let's go." But Elijah couldn't move. His eyes locked with the face of the officer leading the assault, a face he would never forget. That man was Officer Brandon Tate. Elijah didn't sleep well after that. He couldn't draw, couldn't focus, couldn't forget. Days passed, and news spread that the officers involved claimed they had never been at the scene. Then came the court date, and Elijah's grandmother received a request for Elijah to testify. One of the accused, Officer Tate, had completely denied being anywhere near the area that night. Elijah was scared. He didn't want to be in court. He didn't want to sit across from a man who wore a badge but had acted like a criminal. But he also couldn't forget what he saw, and he couldn't ignore the lie being told. "Grandma, do I have to?" he asked one evening, his voice barely above a whisper. His grandmother, seated beside him on the couch, took his hand gently. "Elijah, baby, you sure you want to go up there and speak?" Elijah looked down at his sketchbook, then back at her. "If I don't, who will?" He knew the answer. He was the only one who saw what really happened, and while he was only 10, his heart knew the weight of truth. Even in fear, he was ready to carry it. Comment brain if you believe kids can be powerful truth-tellers too, because sometimes it is not the loudest voice that changes the world. It is the truest one. The courtroom was packed. Rows of reporters filled the benches, notebooks open, cameras ready. Community members, family, and law students sat shoulder to shoulder, their attention fixed on the front of the room. Everyone was waiting for the same thing: the testimony of a 10-year-old boy who had seen what no one else had the courage to talk about. Elijah Moore sat at the witness table, small in stature but steady in presence. His fingers gripped the edge of the chair, knuckles white. His sketchbook, the one that rarely left his side, was tucked away in his backpack. Today, it was his voice that would do the drawing, sketching out a moment that changed everything. Judge Monroe adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. "Do you understand the importance of telling the truth today, Elijah?" Elijah nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." The defense attorney began, voice calm but strategic. "Elijah, can you tell us what you saw that night?" Elijah took a breath. They pushed him down, even when he said stop. They didn't stop. Whispers passed through the courtroom. The defense attorney continued with carefully worded questions, trying to discredit a child without appearing cruel. Then came the moment that would stop everything. The prosecutor, clear and calm, asked the question everyone had been waiting for. "Elijah, do you recognize any of the people who hurt that man?" Elijah's throat tightened. He looked down at his hands, then slowly lifted his head. His voice shook. "Yes," he said. Then louder, stronger, "He was there." He raised his hand and pointed directly at Officer Brandon Tate. The courtroom froze. Gasps echoed. Cameras clicked. Officer Tate's jaw tensed. His eyes narrowed. The man who'd confidently denied even being present now sat exposed. "This kid's confused," Tate barked. "He's a child." Elijah didn't flinch. "I'm not confused. You were the one who hit him first." Judge Monroe looked startled. Reporters scrambled to jot every word. A silence fell over the room like a heavy blanket. For a moment, the legal titles, uniforms, and positions of power didn't matter. What mattered was that a child, small, nervous, and brave, had told the truth with unwavering clarity. Comment: I believe Elijah if you're standing with this brave young truth-teller, because sometimes the most powerful voice in the room is the one no one expects, Elijah Moore's moment of bravery did not end inside the courtroom. His words, and more importantly the truth he spoke, echoed far beyond the walls of that building. Within hours of his testimony, a video clip showing the exact moment Elijah pointed at Officer Brandon Tate and shouted, "He was there!" had gone viral. Shared across social media platforms, the clip amassed over 3 million views in a single night. Hashtags like #Justice for Elijah and #Truth from the Young began trending nationwide. Elijah, the 10-year-old boy who had been terrified to speak, was now being hailed as a hero. The courtroom had no choice but to respond. Judge Monroe ordered a pause in the trial, citing the need to review additional evidence that had surfaced due to public attention. Suddenly, this was no longer just a local matter. It had become a national one. A new witness stepped forward. A local store owner who had been hesitant to get involved now felt compelled by Elijah's courage. He turned over security footage from the night of the incident. The video clearly showed Officer Tate's patrol car parked near the scene, contradicting Tate's sworn statement. The footage added weight to Elijah's account and shattered the defense's credibility. It was undeniable proof that Elijah had not only told the truth, but had done so under immense pressure. As the footage circulated, public pressure surged. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse holding signs that read, "Protect Elijah. Hold Officer Tate accountable. Truth has no age." Civil rights organizations stepped in to support Elijah and his family. They provided legal protection, counseling services, and security. Elijah's grandmother, overwhelmed by the response, held her grandson close and whispered, "You did good, baby. You did real good." Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere shifted. The defense, once confident, now scrambled to regroup. Prosecutors prepared to introduce the new evidence in full. Elijah had not only changed the direction of the case, he had changed the tone of the entire judicial process. Outside, people shared their own stories of witnessing injustice and staying silent. Elijah's courage reminded them of the power of truth, especially when spoken by those least expected to carry such weight. Comment hard if you believe no child should be silenced for telling the truth, because when one voice speaks up, it gives courage to others. And when that voice belongs to a child like Elijah Moore, the world has no choice but to listen. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Officer Brandon Tate was recalled to the witness stand. The atmosphere had shifted since Elijah Moore's emotional testimony and the emergence of new evidence. This was no longer a case teetering on doubt. It was a case leaning heavily on truth. And all eyes were now on Tate. The prosecutor stood with calm precision, holding the remote to the courtroom's media screen. "Officer Tate," the prosecutor began, "why did you lie under oath?" Tate, straightening in his uniform, replied flatly, "I didn't lie. I was mistaken." A wave of murmurs swept through the courtroom. Judge Monroe raised a hand for silence, but said nothing yet. The prosecutor gave no reaction. Instead, he clicked the remote. The screen lit up with security footage, the one retrieved from the local store owner. It showed Tate's patrol car parked just blocks away from where the assault took place. Moments later, Tate himself was seen clearly exiting the vehicle, walking toward the scene. There was no mistaking it. His badge, his gait, his face, all captured. Gasps rippled through the courtroom like a lightning strike. Some covered their mouths. Reporters leaned forward, typing furiously. Elijah sat quietly in the gallery, his grandmother holding his hand tightly. Officer Tate's face lost its color. His jaw tensed. For a long moment he said nothing. Judge Monroe, voice sharp and commanding, slammed the gavel once. "Officer Tate, you are now under investigation for perjury and excessive force," the judge announced. "This court will not tolerate lies under oath, especially not from those entrusted to uphold the law." The room fell into a stunned silence. Tate had tried to outmaneuver a child's truth with a badge and a lie, but he had underestimated the weight of honesty spoken from the heart. Elijah's voice, small yet steady, had unraveled an entire cover-up. He had faced a uniformed adult in court and told the truth without flinching. His courage had sparked a chain reaction, one that revealed corruption, validated his witness, and put accountability back on the table. Outside the courthouse, the story was spreading even faster. Civil rights leaders praised Elijah's bravery. Social media erupted with support. Elijah didn't seek attention. He didn't want fame. But his words had become the fire that reignited trust in the power of truth. Comment: Justice speaks, if you believe Elijah's courage deserves recognition. Because sometimes the truth does not come from a position of power. It comes from a child willing to speak up when no one else will. The courtroom may have quieted, but the echoes of Elijah Moore's testimony continued to reverberate far beyond its walls. The man who had been brutally assaulted, falsely accused and buried beneath Officer Tate's lies, was finally released. Every charge against him was dropped, thanks to the truth that Elijah had the courage to speak. Officer Tate, once confident in the uniform he wore, was suspended from duty. A formal indictment soon followed, charging him with perjury, obstruction of justice, and excessive use of force. The justice system had begun to turn inward, forced to face the consequences of protecting the wrong people for far too long. Elijah's actions, though born from fear and truth, led to sweeping changes across Atlanta. The police department came under pressure from city leaders, legal advocates, and the public. In response, they introduced new mandatory reforms. Among the most significant was a policy mandating the consistent use of body cameras by all on-duty officers. No longer could stories be buried under silence and paperwork. Additionally, a groundbreaking measure was passed that required all testimonies, regardless of the witness's age, to be given full and equal weight in court proceedings. A child's voice, once dismissed, now carried legal weight it had long been denied. The city, the courtroom, and the community began to shift, all because one 10-year-old chose truth over silence. Elijah, still processing everything, stood outside the courthouse one afternoon during a press conference. A reporter leaned forward with a microphone. "Elijah, were you scared?" He nodded. "I was scared. But truth is more important than fear." That simple sentence landed with the impact of a thunderclap. It became a rallying cry, not just for Atlanta, but for communities around the country where children often see more than they should and rarely get the chance to be believed. Support flooded in from every corner. Civil rights organizations honored Elijah with Youth Justice Awards. Schools began discussing his story in classrooms. His courage was featured in op-eds and educational forums about the importance of listening to young voices. And through it all, Elijah remained humble. He didn't want fame or praise. He wanted fairness. He wanted his mother's memory to live on in his courage. He wanted other children like him to know that their voices mattered. Elijah's story had become more than just a court case. It was now a movement. Comment: if Elijah's courage moved you to tears. Because sometimes the smallest voices carry the strongest truth and the power to change everything. Months after the trial that changed everything, Elijah Moore stood on a brightly lit stage at a national youth justice event. The room was filled with advocates, educators, community leaders, and children who had traveled from across the country to witness the moment. Elijah, now known far beyond Atlanta, was being honored with the Bravery and Justice Award, an accolade reserved for those who had displayed extraordinary courage in the face of injustice. He stood small at the podium, barely tall enough to reach the microphone without a box beneath his feet. At his side, holding his hand gently, was his grandmother, the woman who had raised him, believed in him, and never once let him face the storm alone. The host introduced Elijah with a heartfelt recounting of his story, the courtroom moment that stunned the nation, and the impact his testimony had on justice reform. The room filled with a thunderous applause as Elijah stepped forward, gripping the edges of the podium the same way he had gripped the witness table months before. He looked out across the crowd. Hundreds of eyes stared back at him, some filled with tears, others filled with pride. He took a breath. The room held it with him. If someone hurts someone else, and you see it, you gotta speak, even if your voice shakes, Elijah said, his voice calm but powerful. The room erupted. People rose from their chairs in a standing ovation. Some clapped through tears, others cheered with joy. It was not just applause for a speech. It was a collective recognition of what Elijah had done and what he had risked. His grandmother looked up at him, her own eyes wet. She clutched his hand a little tighter, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's my baby." In that moment, Elijah was not just the 10-year-old who told the truth in court. He was a symbol of what courage can look like at any age. He had gone from a quiet boy in Atlanta to a national voice for truth, justice, and the power of speaking up. The award placed around his neck shimmered under the lights, but it was his words that truly carried weight. Teachers would quote him in classrooms. His story would become part of curriculum about civic responsibility. And to those who felt afraid to speak, Elijah had given a gift more valuable than gold, proof that bravery does not mean fearlessness. It means acting, even when fear is present. Comment: Elijah is a hero, if you believe this young man just taught us all a lesson. Because in a world that too often ignores the smallest voices, Elijah reminded us that those voices can roar the loudest when they speak the truth. Elijah Moore showed the world that truth does not have an age. In a world that often overlooks the voices of children, he proved that even the smallest voice can spark monumental change. His bravery in that courtroom did not just shift the direction of one case, it triggered a movement. The impact of Elijah's testimony went far beyond the trial. His words became the catalyst for a deeper examination of police accountability, especially in cases involving excessive force. Communities across the country looked to Atlanta and saw a blueprint for change rooted in truth, compassion, and courage. Thanks to Elijah's courage, real reforms were enacted. New policies were introduced that required law enforcement to wear body cameras at all times and mandated that every testimony, regardless of the witness's age, be treated with full seriousness and legal weight. No longer could a child's perspective be dismissed as confusion or irrelevance. Elijah had changed the rules, but his impact didn't stop with policy. Elijah's story became a symbol of strength in schools, community centers, and even courtrooms across the country. Teachers shared his story with students. Activists cited his name during rallies. Judges and attorneys remembered that moment, the trembling finger pointing at power, and were reminded of their duty to seek truth, not just procedure. Elijah Moore didn't just speak up. He spoke for every child who had ever been silenced, for every witness whose truth was overlooked, for every person who thought they were too small, too afraid, or too alone to make a difference. And he did all of this without seeking recognition. Elijah simply wanted the truth to be heard. He wanted what happened that night on the street to be acknowledged and corrected. And in doing so, he became a hero not just of his own story, but of many. Comment: Truth knows no age. If you believe Elijah's story is a reminder that no one is too young to stand up for what is right. Want more stories where the smallest voices cause the biggest impact? Watch our next video, Black Girl Interrupted the Judge. My stepfather is lying. Her revelation shocked everyone. Hit subscribe and turn on the bell because you won't want to miss the next story of real justice, real heroes, and real impact. Keep sharing these stories, speak up, and keep the truth alive